Every night at exactly 11:40, the farmer saw the same figure standing at the edge of his cornfield. At first, he thought it was a scarecrow. Then he thought it was a person. By the fifth night, he stopped believing either explanation. The figure was too tall to be a child, too thin to be an ordinary man, and completely motionless. It stood approximately 50 yards beyond the fence, surrounded by rows of corn that moved constantly in the Kansas wind. But the figure never moved with them. It simply stood there, watching the farmhouse. The farmer's name was Daniel Mercer, at least according to the story that would later circulate among a handful of people who claimed to have heard what happened. He lived alone on a small property outside a rural Kansas town, where the nights were so quiet that he could hear the old wooden fence creaking from his bedroom window. Daniel had spent most of his life around farmland. He knew what deer looked like in darkness. He knew how shadows behaved under moonlight. He knew the difference between a person standing in a field and a tree moving in the wind. That was why the figure bothered him. It didn't behave like anything he knew. The first time he saw it, he was standing on his porch after dinner. It was late in the evening, and he had gone outside to check whether a storm was approaching. That's when he noticed something at the edge of the corn. A pale figure was standing between the rows. Daniel stared at it for several seconds. He called out, "Hey!" The figure didn't respond. He assumed it was someone trespassing. Daniel walked toward the fence. The figure remained completely still. He called again. Nothing. Then a gust of wind moved across the field. The corn bent almost flat. The figure remained upright. Daniel stopped. For the first time, he felt something he couldn't explain. Fear. He went back inside. The next morning, he convinced himself that he had probably seen a person standing in the field, maybe someone hunting, maybe a neighbor checking the crops. But that explanation lasted only until the following night. At exactly 11:40, Daniel looked out the same window. The figure was back. Same place. Same posture. Same distance from the farmhouse. He watched it for nearly 20 minutes. It never moved. Then, at midnight, Daniel turned away for only a few seconds. When he looked back, the figure was gone. The field was empty. The following night it returned, and the night after that. Every night, at approximately the same time, the figure appeared at the edge of the cornfield. Daniel began keeping the curtains closed. He stopped going outside after dark. He started checking the locks twice before going to bed. But on the fifth night, something changed. The figure was closer. It wasn't standing at the edge of the field anymore. It was approximately 20 yards from the fence. Daniel immediately noticed the difference. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The beam crossed the grass and reached the figure. For the first time, Daniel saw its face. The skin appeared gray and unnaturally smooth. The head looked too large for the body. The eyes were dark and wide. The arms hung almost completely straight at its sides. Daniel stood frozen. He raised the flashlight higher. The figure didn't cover its eyes. It didn't turn away. It simply stared at him. Daniel shouted, "Get off my property." The figure remained silent. Then Daniel noticed something that made his stomach drop. The figure was smiling. Not a normal smile. Its mouth had barely moved. But somehow Daniel knew it was smiling. He backed toward the door. The figure took one step forward. Daniel slammed the door shut. He locked it. Then he stood there listening. Nothing. No footsteps. No voices. No movement outside. He waited several minutes before looking through the window again. The field was empty. But the next morning, Daniel found something near the fence. A perfect circle had been pressed into the grass. Inside the circle were several strange footprints. They weren't shaped like human footprints. They were long and narrow, with 3 deep impressions at the front. Daniel photographed them. Then he called his neighbor. The neighbor came over, looked at the marks, and laughed. He told Daniel it was probably some animal. Daniel didn't argue. He simply told him to look toward the cornfield. The neighbor did. The figure was standing there, in broad daylight. For the first time, the neighbors stopped laughing. They both watched it from the porch. The figure didn't move. Then the neighbor said something Daniel would remember for the rest of his life. "That's not a man." They went inside. Neither of them approached the field. That afternoon, Daniel called the sheriff. He explained what he had seen. The sheriff came to the property and inspected the field. There was no trespasser, no hunting equipment, no vehicle tracks. No obvious explanation for the footprints. The sheriff told Daniel to call if the person returned. But that night, Daniel didn't wait for the figure to appear. He sat in his kitchen with the lights turned off, watching the field through a small gap in the curtains. 11:30. Nothing. 11:35. Nothing. 11:40. Nothing. Daniel almost felt relieved. Then something moved near the barn. He looked toward it. The figure was no longer in the cornfield. It was standing beside the barn, only 30 feet from the house. Daniel couldn't breathe. The figure turned its head toward the kitchen window. It knew exactly where he was. Then it raised one hand. Daniel stepped backward. The figure pointed toward the cornfield, and then it pointed toward Daniel. He didn't understand what it meant, until he heard something behind him. 3 knocks. Daniel slowly turned toward the front door. Knock. 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 The figure was outside, but the door was on the opposite side of the house. Daniel didn't move. Another 3 knocks came from the back door. He grabbed a shotgun. He checked the hallway. Nothing. The knocking stopped. Then his dog began barking. Daniel ran toward the kitchen. The dog was staring through the glass door at something standing in the yard. Daniel looked. The figure was only a few feet away. Its face was pressed close to the glass. The eyes were completely black. Daniel raised the shotgun. The figure didn't move. For several seconds they stared at each other. Then something happened that Daniel would later struggle to explain. He heard a voice. Not through his ears. Inside his head. It was only one word. Come. Daniel dropped the shotgun. He stepped backward. The figure moved away from the glass. Then it turned and walked toward the corn. Daniel watched it disappear between the rows. He didn't sleep that night. The following morning, he found another set of footprints. This time they began at his back door. They continued across the yard, then disappeared at the edge of the cornfield. Daniel packed a bag. He decided to leave. But before he could start his truck, he noticed something lying on the hood. A small object. It looked like a piece of black stone. Daniel picked it up. It was warm, almost hot. And when he held it in his hand, he felt something strange. A vibration. Not enough to hear, just enough to feel. He dropped it immediately. The object remained on the ground. Then it began to move. Slowly. It rolled across the driveway toward the cornfield. Daniel watched it disappear between the rows. That was when he realized the figure hadn't been randomly appearing near his farm. It had been leading him somewhere. That night, Daniel did something he had promised himself he would never do. He walked into the cornfield. He carried a flashlight and a loaded rifle. The moon was bright enough to illuminate the rows. He followed the footprints, one after another, deeper into the field. The farther he walked, the quieter everything became. No insects, no wind, no rustling leaves, nothing. Then he reached the center of the field and saw the figure. It was standing approximately 20 feet away. Daniel raised the flashlight. The beam illuminated its face. This time, the figure didn't look threatening. It looked afraid. Daniel lowered the rifle slightly. "Why are you here?" The figure stared at him. Then it raised one hand. A strange light appeared behind it. Daniel turned. Between the rows of corn was something enormous, hovering above the ground. It made no sound. There were no visible flames, no propellers, no engines, just a dark shape surrounded by a faint glow. Daniel looked back at the figure. The creature pointed toward the object. Then it pointed toward the sky. And Daniel suddenly understood what it wanted. It wasn't watching his house. It wasn't stalking him. It was waiting. Waiting for something. The light above the field became brighter. The creature took one step backward. Daniel suddenly felt a pressure inside his chest. He heard the same voice inside his head. This time there were 2 words. Don't follow. Then the creature disappeared. Not ran. Not walked away. One moment it was standing in front of him. The next moment it was gone. The strange object above the field rose silently into the night sky. Within seconds, it was nothing more than a tiny point of light. Then it vanished. Daniel remained standing alone in the cornfield. When he returned to the farmhouse, the clock on his kitchen wall read 3:12 in the morning. He believed he had been outside for perhaps 20 minutes, but according to the clock, more than 3 hours had passed. He never understood where that time went. The next morning, he found something else. The footprints had disappeared. The circle in the grass was gone. The black object was gone. And there was no evidence that anything had ever been in the field. Except for one thing. On the inside of Daniel's kitchen window, someone had drawn a symbol. 3 curved lines surrounded by a small circle. Daniel didn't recognize it. But according to the story, he had seen the same symbol before. It was scratched into the wall of the barn, and it had been there for years. Long before he ever saw the figure, Daniel eventually left the farm. He never publicly claimed that he had met an extraterrestrial. He reportedly told only a few people what he believed had happened. And even then, he refused to explain everything, because there was one part of the story he allegedly never told anyone. The final night he saw the figure, he had asked it one last question. Why me? According to the story, the answer came inside his mind. You saw us. Whether that conversation ever happened is impossible to establish. There is no verified record of the farmer, no authenticated photograph of the creature. No scientific evidence proving that something non-human stood in that Kansas cornfield. But stories like this continue to appear across rural America. Farmers seeing strange figures. Families hearing unexplained noises. Pilots reporting objects that seem to ignore the laws of physics. And witnesses describing the same unsettling detail. The feeling that whatever they encountered wasn't simply observing them. It was waiting for them to notice. Maybe the Kansas farmer saw nothing more than a person standing in a field. Maybe shadows, fear, exhaustion, and imagination turned something ordinary into something impossible. Or maybe something really did stand at the edge of that cornfield every night. Maybe it watched the farmhouse because it was looking for someone. And maybe, when it finally came closer, it wasn't coming to attack. It was coming to ask for help. The farmer left that field alive. But he never forgot the final message. Don't follow. Because sometimes the most frightening part of an encounter isn't what comes out of the darkness. It's the possibility that whatever is standing there already knows your name.